Yeah, let's talk about Gary Gensler because he called what stablecoins the poker chips in the Wild West. They're threatening to regulate the lending of stablecoins, and yet, Tarun, right now I'm 20 hours into a course he taught at MIT Sloan School in 2018 on blockchain, and Gary really understands. He's one of the smarter guys that I've ever heard talk about this stuff. And he was working with Silvio Macaulay there and was quoting him on his cryptography. And he really explains it well. This is before I think he was even at the CFTC, and obviously before he was at the SEC. And so it's very interesting to see him kind of agnostically talk about what blockchain was doing back in 18. And yet now, when he talks, he feels like a politician, because I guess he is kind of a politician. It feels like he's got a blunt instrument, a department that lacks funds, and he's trying to do enough to scare people not to abuse maybe coin offerings, but also trying to keep the innovation going and maybe failing at both. What do you see that maybe I don't see in Gensler or the SEC, and even regulation as part of a cycle you've talked about before of bull and bear runs? So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't, with Gensler, I don't exactly know what to make of it, kind of for the same reasons you do, of like, he's clearly spent a lot of time thinking about crypto stuff. But I certainly hope never to work in government. So I don't understand the pressures of actually working in government. I'm sure it's more complicated socially, socio-politically, socio-dynamically than any of us can see on the outside. That being said, I do find the stable coins or poker chips thing kind of crazy, a little bit. Because, I think I saw a funny comparison where someone looked at like stablecoin volatility relative to like muni bond volatility for US municipals. And it was like, they're like way safer than some of these like AAA rated bonds.
Right.
In terms of like, so I don't really have a great understanding of like why there's this kind of push, other than, the US sees a ton of capital moving into something and can't tax it. But I don't really know where we go with regulation. Like I do think one of the more interesting things, and we've written a bunch of papers on this recently, is what does privacy actually mean in DeFi? So one of the big questions hidden in all this regulation stuff is like, where does privacy stand? So of course you've seen with Zcash and Monero, right? Regulators really heavy-handedly killed them, where they like went to every exchange and were like, travel rule, you cannot list this, you cannot do this, and right, and like they have really crimped the growth of those networks. On the other hand, there's a sense in which people do realize that right now DeFi is sort of weird, and that there's absolutely no privacy. There's like no privacy at all in any of your transactions, which is in some ways what governments should want, for their sort of poker chip monitoring software. But I do think there's this bigger question of like, what amount of privacy will governments tolerate in these types of systems? And this feels like the beginning of the war on that, and the beginning of like the war that will come for that. That we haven't quite hit on the technical side yet, but in the next 5 years, like 2 to 5 years, I think regulators will be much more have to face that question much more seriously.
Do you think Gary's saying these things about stablecoins because they see a stablecoin success competing with the digital dollar, which now will have to compete with the digital yuan, which according to Alex Mashinsky is the next World War III, is a currency war of, digital coins between the U.S. and China. That sounds a little
Every
sci-fi.
war since the 1700s is a currency war. That's what I will make that claim.
I love that claim. Can you talk more about that? Expand on that.
Well, the history of debt in the Western world is very much tied to wars, where different European countries would like borrow from each other to basically fund their local wars. And I think the British were actually quite successful at being sort of the mercantilist lenders, and which kind of, I would say, in part because they could tax far parts of the British Empire and then lend out that money to European people trying to fight wars. So I think there's a very intertwined history. I'm trying to remember which book I read that was like it was this like historian that wrote this book about like the how debts either caused or funded wars, and the debts were all just like between these different countries.
Right.
And so, if you take a squint from that angle, and everything kind of does sort of seem like, it's a currency war, just in a slightly different form.
Right, and including U.S. China, right? It ultimately is, right? Currency war, power war.
For sure. So I do think I could see the digital currency thing being that, but I don't know how to say this in a somewhat polite way, but I feel like the people working in DeFi and like AI stuff are like a million times more competent than the people working on CBDCs and digital dollars. Like just like the level of talent, the disparity between the level of talent between the two is so large that it's really hard for me to imagine these government currency is really taking off. Like it's truly mind-boggling how much worse the talent that's working on like central bank digital currency type of stuff is. And I there's some obvious reasons for that, but there's also just this fact of like this doesn't seem like an appealing job for someone smart.